let me find it here. How do silos work in a complex system? So you talk about climate, it's probably the poster child of a complex system. Everything interacts with everything else. We don't even know what some of the interactions are yet, but we're learning. We can model them, and we had a very interesting early morning session on how to model the climate system. It was quite clear that we're getting some of the things right. We're getting better and better, but we have a long way to go to really get it to the level that we'd like to understand.
So George, who participated in that? Just out of curiosity.
Thanks, Don. That was Liz Moyer and Rao Kodamarthi.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah,
folks that you know.
Yeah.
And lots of questions from the fellows. So we want to, of course, keep that up. That's been, I think, a signature of this year's SISE. The fellows are very interactive. And you'll see in just a heartbeat, I think, fellows, exactly what you want to ask about as soon as we ask our two panelists to start talking. Let me introduce them. Pam Sydelko, as Thomas was saying, frequent speaker at SISE. She's now president of Fat Node Consulting, and we might ask her to explain that name. She probably has an explanation for it. She's been a systems scientist for nearly 30 years, a lot of that time working at Argonne. That's how we met her initially, of course. She's led the design and development of many integrated systems applications spanning national security, environmental sustainability, and critical infrastructure. So all of those things, of course, like everything in the world, they're related to climate change. As president of Fat Node Consulting, she focuses on systems thinking approaches to complex or quote unquote wicked problems. Her passion is the use of systems thinking to better understand and manage complexity. And then we have Don Wuebbles. He led these from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and many other places. He led the development of the Center for Urban Resilience and Environmental Sustainability, which has the acronym CURES, great name, across the 3 University of Illinois campuses, and he serves as its director. From 2015 to 2017, he was the assistant director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, in Washington, and was the White House expert on climate science. He was head of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at UIUC from 1994 to 2006. He's an expert on atmospheric physics and chemistry, has over 500 scientific publications related to the Earth's climate and air quality, and the ozone layer, things like that. But his work goes well beyond that academic focus through providing analysis and metrics used in national and international policy. So he's been a coordinating lead author on several of the IPCC reports, and in particular the first volume, separately, the first volume of the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment, which was published in 2017. And that assesses, of course, the effect of climate change on the United States. Very recently, he co-led a special assessment of the impacts of climate change on the state of Illinois. That was published in May of 2021. Interestingly, he has 2 degrees in electrical engineering. I don't think you would have guessed that from his later career, and a PhD in atmospheric sciences. So I think that's the intro. I think what we'll do is ask each of our panelists to maybe talk for 5 minutes or so to kind of say what they think is important, what they think you fellows should know, and then we'll open it to questions. And after that, put your questions in the chat, please. And maybe we'll start with Pam. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be part of this panel. Thank you, George. And I'm kind of thinking that the best way to maybe talk about what I do and where I'm at is to give you a little bit of where I've come from. And so my background is environmental science. I have a bachelor's degree in botany and a master's in soil science. And when I was thinking about doing a PhD, and this was long before probably many of you were born, I wanted to do an ecosystem science PhD. I really wanted to start putting things together because clearly I was interested in land use and things were all interconnected, and it felt like I should have a curriculum that would bring that together. And at that time, there really wasn't a lot of options. They just didn't have this concept of maybe having myself set in one department and then being able to have other advisors from other departments to kind of bring together an integrated approach. And so I did not go get my PhD at that time, and I actually ended up working for Argonne National Laboratory as a GIS specialist early on, because GIS let me put things together. And so clearly my career has always been about, I can't see things in silos. I have to see things kind of as systems. And before I even knew what systems were. And so when I worked at Argonne, I did environmental work, GIS work, and then I met a group of people who were doing really interested integrated modeling and simulation. And I thought, here's a great way to have a decision tool where we can integrate models to actually ask questions about what if we were to do this in land use, or what if we were to make this policy decision? How could we maybe anticipate where it might go and make those decisions better? I did that for many, many years, and we had really big sponsors, EPA, DOE, DOD, and we actually delivered decision support tools to these people for some of the more complex land use problems that they had. Unfortunately, as much as the technology was awesome, and as fun as it was really to do, very rarely did these systems actually make a difference. And the reason I began to discover is because we would deliver these systems to a sponsor that was only just a part of the problem, or a part of the solution to the problem. They didn't have the ability to reach across agencies or reach across domains to bring the other people who were clearly part of the problem into this decision making. So it was like basically taking an integrated program and sticking it right into a silo. And so, I just started noticing that this seemed to be kind of a consistent problem. And it became more evident as I started doing really big integrations. I worked on a couple that had, 7 national laboratories working together to try to do a climate change, assessment and a climate change anticipation for future conflicts for national security. And, millions of dollars, and great scientists and awesome people working together to try to find the way that we can make these things work. And yet it didn't work again. So, and so later in my career, actually just before I retired, I met a group of people over in the University of Hull, and in a larger group of people who are systems thinkers and systems scientists who have a much different view of systems than I did. I had a very positivist, reductionist, scientific view of things like climate change. And it became evident to me that even though those things are really important, modeling and simulation, all these things I've done are really important, that's not where you start. And so I'm currently in a PhD program, and I'm working with a fellow called Gerald Midgley at the University of Hull. And I've learned a whole lot about systems approaches to wicked problems or complex problems that are much more of open to participation by stakeholders. The problem is something that can't be defined by one expert. I'm going to hold this up, but this is the way I always think of a lot of policies, right? We have experts that can basically say, okay, I've gathered all the data and I'm the expert. I know the problem, which typically they don't, because the problem's so complex that one person couldn't possibly know all of it. And it is decidedly so, right? And that is not what system science teaches. System science teaches more of this is what a system looks like, right? This is a toy that, Thomas and George are quite familiar with, but this is elements of the system or the problem are these nodes. And then we've got connectors, right? So everything's interconnected. And the way that they're connected changes and morphs that system, so that if we're really trying to understand that system, we have to look at it from different worldviews, right? Because everyone has a perception of the world that's different from each other, and you cannot get away from that no matter how much you want to say that we have data to say, here's what the system looks like. And so systems science and systems thinking gives you tools to actually do that part. And then once you have that problem somewhat defined, problem structuring it's called, with stakeholders and various different experts really kind of coming in together, that's when you start designing your systems, right? That's when you design, how are you going to respond to that? How are we going to respond now? And how are we going to anticipate changes so we can respond and adapt in the future? And so those are the tools that I've been learning. I'm just finishing my PhD. I did my PhD on a subject of transnational organized crime. And I included agencies from a number of different agencies in the United States and designed what we called a interagency approach using these systems tools to try to look at how we can de-silo, our responses without having to create a whole new government structure, right? We don't have to take and do away with agencies and create new ones. We take the ones we have, but we make them work as a system, as a complex system that has the ability to adapt and change as the environment or the problem, say climate change, evolves. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of like, I guess, where I'm at and what I do and what I would love to be able to help others do and teach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pam. Great intro. Don.
Thanks, George. Yeah, it's hard to follow up upon Pam. That's wonderful. I think I could learn from her.
Likewise.
So I'm an atmospheric scientist, but my work has also gone well beyond atmospheric science, as you've already heard. And so cutting through silos, trying to be more systems oriented has kind of been a way of life for me. I started out, as you heard, in electrical engineering. I wanted to be a scientist of some sort, an applied scientist, but I wasn't quite sure what to go into. I went in electrical engineering as a start. As a graduate student, I became involved in a problem for the atmosphere, and totally by accident, kind of. It just actually what happened is I was starting graduate school. I needed a summer job because I had just gotten married, and before graduate school started, I needed to be doing something and earn a little money for us. And in the process, it was an atmospheric issue. And I almost on the spot said, wow, this is so cool. Because it took everything I had learned as an engineer, which is very broad, and how one applies physics and math and chemistry and other disciplines together, which is what engineering is all about, to and then applying that to now applying it to the basic problems of how we understand our atmosphere and what is happening to it. So I, as a graduate student, I switched in basically becoming an atmospheric scientist. I could do that within electrical engineering at Illinois because it's what happened. The aeronomy lab was part of the university at that time, which was study of the upper atmosphere. And they were doing that because of the effects of the atmosphere on wave propagation and how it affected the electrical propagation through the atmosphere, wave propagation of the atmosphere. So radio waves, things like that. So that, so in the process, I became involved. I was asked, well, could I work with a visiting professor? What ends up that visiting professor, Tatsuo Shimazaki from NOAA, even though he was Japanese originally, had come to the US and was working with NOAA, was one of the very first modelers of atmospheric chemistry. And he was, at that time, was modeling the mesosphere, the very upper atmosphere and above. But he was moving down to the stratosphere because it was becoming to be known right at that time that supersonic transports maybe would fly in the stratosphere. And actually, we built the Concorde. The Boeing aircraft was never built. And that we needed to understand what impact these aircraft could have on stratospheric ozone. About 90% of the ozone in the atmosphere is in the stratosphere. And so I started working with Tatsuo as a graduate student, and then he asked me to join him at NOAA when he moved back. So I got a master's degree and moved to Boulder, Colorado for a couple of years before I then went to Lawrence Livermore National Lab and eventually finished my PhD at part-time at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. And I became an atmospheric modeler. And while I was at Livermore, many of my colleagues were leading experts in the study of climate change in its very beginning, and I saw what they were doing. I was studying stratosphere and studying atmospheric chemistry and physics and modeling of those things, and I said, well, I can do that too. So I started kind of doing some studies on the composition of the atmosphere and how it related to climate change. And before I know it, I had kind of become a leader, and I was asked to become one of the very first leaders of the in the international climate assessments, and in part because I had developed policy concepts for ozone, a concept called ozone depletion potentials being a major one that is included in the international policies for protecting the ozone layer. They wanted something similar for climate, and we came up in the very first IPCC assessment with a concept called global warming potentials that then is applied to looking at how different gases affect climate, and it's still being used. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, you'll find that it uses global warming potentials, and they talk about things like equivalent carbon dioxide, and that's based on my concept. So I get involved in these policy-related questions, but in more recent times, over the last few decades now, I've been very interested in how the changes in climate, how changes in atmospheric chemistry also, because I'm still involved in those issues as well. I developed one of the very first models for air quality as well. And how humans interact with the atmosphere. And so that was a major contributor to all the studies I've done with climate change. But then I began to wonder how climate change impacts upon humans and society and ecosystems in turn. That has led me to leading a lot of these assessments that you heard about. So I've been a leader in special assessments of the Great Lakes region. Illinois, I led as you heard from George, I led the first volume of the last National Climate Assessment. I've been involved with essentially all the national climate assessments, but I've particularly been a leader in the last three. And right now, the government is just today announcing the new leader, which would be Allison Crimmins from EPA, of the fifth National Climate Assessment. And I hope to be heavily involved in that as well. So these assessments are aimed at helping us look at climate's impact on society in rather broad ways. Of course, we also end up falling into the trap of silos because you have to look at various sectors separately to some degree. But we also recognize that the world is more complex than that. If we look at what's going on in a city like Chicago, climate change is just one of many different stresses affecting the city. And we need to be able to look at how climate change fits in with how the leaders of not only the city of Chicago, but the surrounding cities, what we call the Chicago region, to be able to, to deal with those stresses, but while considering climate change. Last year, I was asked to write a special chapter for the update to the ASHRAE. ASHRAE is the ASHRAE handbook. The ASHRAE is the American Society, and I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but it's Heating and Refrigeration Engineers, and I'm missing part of the acronym, but basically it's the guide to engineers across the country that look at heating and refrigeration issues. Very large refrigeration units, for example, that might be in large buildings. If you look at engineering in a general sense, whether it's highways or it's many other aspects of our society, but including things like ASHRAE, traditionally they've had this set of rules. Here's how you deal with the environment, and those rules did not take into account climate change. They usually consider the way things have been in the past. You know, what's the likelihood of a very unusual heating event or flooding event or a drought, and but those things are all changing with the changing climate. The likelihood of such events are changing, and so they have not been accounting for that. So what we're trying to do now is trying to get engineers to more fully consider those kind of issues, that while they're trying to do engineering related to some infrastructure aspect, that they're also looking at climate as part of that. So breaking down silos, as Pam talked about, is extremely important, but at the same time, and taking a systematic approach is important. I tend to look at life through looking at Venn diagrams, you know, looking at the overlaps between different stresses, and then how we look at trying to then look towards solutions. We're currently trying to develop new projects actually related to how we look at the Chicago region in terms of nature-based solutions to help with some of the key issues related to climate, such as extreme heat and the water issues, extreme water. More water tends to, I don't know what you heard in your earlier thing today, but yeah, one of the big issues for Chicago is flooding, because of more precipitation is coming as larger events. We've had about a 10% increase in the overall precipitation, but more of that coming in winter and spring. And now, but also that when it does rain or snow, it's more likely to be a larger event than it is in the past. So how do we take that into account as we look at potential solutions? Now, I think I'll leave it there because I'm just kind of rambling, but I'm hoping that those concepts kind of fit in together with the kind of things you want to look at.
Great. Thanks for those intros, both of you, Don and Pam. Questions are flowing in. Actually, Adele has a question. Adele, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, George. My question is related to the current atmospheric models that are being worked on right now. And I was curious how prevalent indoor pollution and health factored into those models, or if the focus was more on outdoor pollution and air quality for regions.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. So when we're talking about looking at climate change or air quality modeling, and sometimes a coupling of those, I do both. We're just doing studies right now looking at how will air quality change if we were to change our energy systems over the coming decades, and looks like it could end up being basically eliminate air quality issues to a large extent. But those models are all aimed at what's going on within the atmosphere. Indoor modeling, indoor pollution is also modeled. There are people who do modeling of that, but those tend to be associated with emissions that happen within a building, and how flow within a building then affects the exposure for human health. So that tends to really be done separately.
So Don, a follow-up, are we better off living indoors or outdoors?
Well, we need to do both, but
True.
our tendency, both, it depends where you're at. Phoenix over the last month has been, every day's been well over 100 degrees, and some days have been as high as 120 degrees. Well, once you get up to those kind of levels, humans really can't be outside. So what's happening in Phoenix, cities like Phoenix right now, is that most of the people are just staying indoors almost continually, and venturing out very, very little. I've heard from friends that if they want to go running, they run in the middle of the night because that's the only time it's cool enough to even consider it. So what's going on outdoors does affect us, but also we don't want to pollute an environment indoors either. Related
to a comment you just made, people often say that climate change makes the nights warmer faster than it makes the days hotter. And I wonder if you could discuss that a little bit.
Well, that's particularly true in the Midwest. It's somewhat true overall, but we're seeing that especially in the Midwest. And here it's because the impacts of the precipitation has kept the soils more moist, and we're having less extreme heat days than many other parts of the country. So if you look at the South or even in parts of the Northwest or Northeast, and certainly the West, almost anything west of the Mississippi, we're seeing large extreme heat going on this summer, but we're not really seeing that much here in the Midwest. And in part, it's because of the soil moisture aspect. And so more warming is occurring at nighttime as a result. The other aspect that relates to that is that climate change isn't just about carbon dioxide or methane or the other greenhouse gases that absorb infrared radiation, which they do, the entire 24 hours, but it is also about what's happening with solar radiation and certain particles, sulfate particles, and some of the organic particles, inorganic particles particularly, tend to reflect sunlight. And so you can actually end up with more warming at night in semi-polluted areas where there's particularly significant concentrations of these aerosols and particles because you're not, because during the daytime you're getting more reflection of the sunlight, and you don't have that impact at night when the infrared radiation effects are continuing to go on.
Noah has a question, and Noah, maybe you could direct this to both panelists.
Yeah, my question is just kind of broad, but what are some of the challenges regarding communication between agencies that are addressing similar issues? And additionally, like, how can you cultivate that collaboration between the agencies?
Well, I can take a shot at that. With my PhD research, the agencies were asked individually first to describe and to put together what we call a system map of the problem. And when they're within themselves and looking at their worldview from, let's say, DEA, they would describe the problem from their experience and from their mission and from what their budget and where they are supposed to, I can touch this, I can't touch this. And so we started with that, and I did it with individual agencies, and then I brought them all together and asked them to actually look at this massive thing that they all kind of contributed to. And so one of the things I think that contributes in the communication issues is clearly protection of turf. Because we budget right down in those silos. So Congress actually will budget an agency and say, if you're working on climate change, you have this part of climate change and we're budgeting down there and that's within your mission. But then the next person over here, they're saying, well, we'll budget you this part, right? Well, the two are so interconnected that the two agencies are looking at each other going, well, I can't give up my mission or my part because I'll lose funding. So that's just human nature, right? People are protecting their own turf. The other thing is trust, because different scientists and different experts in these agencies, they all have ways of being promoted, and most of those ways, are about their individual accomplishments and their individual, contributions. And so when you get teams of people together to try, it's harder to give credit within those agencies. So we have to overcome those. People have to be given credit, maybe even more credit, for being a part of a team that does something versus that their individual agency says, yeah, you really did great for EPA, right? So those are a couple of those communication things that can be overcome when you actually get them to understand that their perspectives are that different, because they don't know that. Most of these folks think they really know the problem, well, they really know they're part of the problem, but when they're forced to actually listen to all the other agencies, when I brought all of those perspectives in, they're like, huh, I never really thought of that. That is a part of the problem. And in some cases could be a root part of the problem that my agency really doesn't have anything to do with, but sure would like to know what's going on at that root problem so we could anticipate what's going to happen for us. So a lot of the communication issues have to do with protection of turf, budgets, and then trust.
So if I can comment, Pam, I think you hit it really the nail right on the head. There is the agencies are to a certain extent siloed intentionally so that they can focus on a piece of the problem, but not overlap, duplicate, maybe even compete for solving the same problem. When it comes to climate change, it touches everything. My sense of climate change is it's the ultimate complex system.
I will add one more thing is that
Sure.
in instances, especially in our country, but elsewhere too, the way to address it is likely a czar, right? Or some one expert that they put in charge of a task force to bring everyone together. Well, that doesn't really help because that czar certainly can't know everything either. Unless the czar is especially good at systems approaches to bring everyone together, it ends up just being another, pretty much another expert. And a lot of times you end up with a report on a shelf that says, here's our assessment. It is not a living, breathing, organized response to the problem.
So great comment. And Don, you're
Yeah.
close to all this when it comes to climate change. What's your perspective?
I have a little, I think everything Pam said was exactly right. The human element is an important part of this process, but I also know that it can work somewhat better. Not entirely, because some of the reasons she mentioned that we maybe don't have enough of living, truly living documents that many of us worry about. But in 1990, Congress does occasionally get some things right, and it developed the U.S. Global Change Act. As part of that, that's what requires that there be a national climate assessment. So it's actually required by Congress. It's for Congress. It's for the president. But it also developed the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is part of OSTP. So this goes back to where I was 5 years ago now, where 4.5 years ago, where OSTP itself tries to help with those coordinations across the agencies. But the entire job of US GCRP is actually to coordinate the agencies on global change issues. So it is dealing with climate change and biodiversity and other issues that are more of a global nature, cutting across the agencies. And there is a member of each agency, 13 different agencies that are part of US GCRP that help guide its actions. Its current director is Mike Cooperberg. Mike was actually the director when I was at the White House as well. And he actually remained there until right at the end of the Trump administration, when that administration fired him. But now the Biden administration has brought him back. Mike's a great leader at doing that, exactly that kind of coordination, getting agencies to talk to each other and to coordinate their activities. So part of its job is actually to help cut across those silos and to get the agencies actually interacting and figure out where, who's going to take responsibility for what. You still got a silo things in terms of how things are funded to some degree. And so it helps coordinate some of that across the agencies. So so certainly there's an attempt within the government to try to do that. Now at the local level, because I don't think when you're talking about the government and communications, it goes all the way from the federal level down to the local level, and you have to figure out how to make all that work as well. And so I look at Chicago, for example, and interactions going on there. I interact a lot with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and the Chicago Metropolitan Planning agency, or Agency for Planning, CMAP. And but there are many other aspects of the city and the communities that need to coordinate in order to really make the right actions happen. And much of the time that works reasonably well. Those two organizations just came out. Actually, today they will be announcing a new report, which is the Climate Action Climate Action Plan for the Chicago region. And that's an update, a major update on an assessment and what was called the Chicago Climate Action Plan back in 2008 that I helped lead. So this would be a major announcement towards how we bring all of the communities in the Chicago region together towards looking at these issues in kind of a united way. And I think, so I think there are some very major steps happening towards trying to help this communication process.
And if I can follow up with a question, the climate issue is going to be around for decades. It doesn't go away quickly, that's for sure. And we've just started to deal with it, let's say at the national level, but you could say at the city of Chicago level equally. It's a new effort. Do we need to maybe change our structures? I mean, back in I'll tell you a little story. Back in the late 1970s, everyone got together and said, we should have a Department of Energy because energy is a big issue. And we've had it since, and it's been very effective. I work for them, and I think they're doing a good job. But we could now say we should have a Department of Climate. Is that something? And you could say that at the Chicago level, you could say that at the state level, you could say that at the federal level. Want to take any bets or just make any comments about, is that a good idea, bad idea? What would happen?
Well, I mentioned Allison Crimmins, who will be the new NCA 5 head under USGCRP, under Mike. And it ends up that Allison this last year wrote, I saw it in several different places, a op-ed that basically said we need a Department of Climate. And I don't fully agree with that, or fully agree or disagree with that. I'm not sure what we need. I do know we need to somehow get to policy and to really make the right actions happen. The changes in climate are known well enough that we know we need action. Now, what is the proper mitigation and adaptations processes we need is what's still in question. And I don't claim to have all the answers. I've suggested, I have reports out there talking about the benefits of a carbon tax and if it's done properly, how it could benefit society. But I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm certainly not an economist who might then critique some of that, although I did that report with an economist. So, do we need a Department of Climate to help pull together the right policies? Maybe, or can we use the existing agencies and more properly integrate them? For example, NOAA has a climate resilience toolkit. Is it what the nation needs for really looking at its resilience? No, but NOAA is aware of that, and actually they have a call for proposals right now that I hope to respond to for helping us make more smart, resilient cities, and working with that climate resilience toolkit, but also using the kind of tools I'm developing that go beyond the current science to be able to get down to the level of details we need to be able to answer the right questions, and combining that with GIS more effectively than we have in the past. We need those things. Do we need a Department of Climate to do that? I'm not sure.
Great answer. Pam, any comment?
Oh, yes, for sure.
I knew it.
Yeah. So I tend to, and I don't know the answer either because, I look to the Department of Homeland Security and how we did that, right? So the Homeland Security, we set that up as a response to a crisis, was 9/11, right? We knew that we had threats coming from all different places and that those threats included health threats, they included infrastructure threats, they included, so we brought together a Department of Homeland Security by picking the pieces from various different agencies and putting them all together. And that actually, one could argue, was not a very successful because it took forever for that agency to gel. The places that they took from now had kind of like, well, what part are they taking and what part are we still doing? And I think that I like the idea of task forces and czars as long as the leadership or the group of folks that lead that are systems thinkers and not necessarily experts, where they are given some authority. And this is called a viable system model, where you have an identity that's separate from what you are in your agency, but you belong to a bigger thing. You belong to the climate task force, right? And you know your role, but you also know the roles of everyone else because you know where you overlap, where things are independent. And I think we can do that. It would require less restructuring and less, financial restructuring of Congress and, all this stuff that comes with creating a new agency, but it has to have some authority. It can't just be a task force that just basically says, we've studied this and here's what we found. It has to be a living, breathing, organized response to the problem where you have, inside, like I think Don said about the successful program he was talking about, the person who leads that is not an uber expert. He sounds like he's a really great facilitator and maybe a systems thinker, and he understands a little bit about everybody else's work, but he can bring them together. And those people are not necessarily trained. We don't have programs that train those people where they actually come with natural abilities to facilitate. They usually come from a background that's part of the problem, but they can see it bigger. And yet we don't teach that, right? And those are really important people if we're going to take wicked problems on, because they're the ones that can actually kind of bring the response together. They're not necessarily siloed into one expert. And so I don't know that a new agency, I mean, it could be set up if it was done very systemically and the leadership understood that they were pulling from other places and not setting up another silo. So,
yeah, that I agree. And by the way, Mike Huberberg is a biologist who was with the Department of Energy before he became the head of USGCRP. Yes.
Great.
Those are great people, but you kind of have to be lucky enough to find one.
I think it is
Mike's
true.
great.
Yeah, I think it is true. You find these leaders and they kind of grow organically out of the ground rather than being designated. Rebecca has a really interesting point in the chat. Rebecca, would you like to say your comment?
Yeah, so I was just saying in the comment section that I'm not saying it's a law to follow, but in the EU, in the European Commission, we actually have a department for climate action, and with Franz Timmermans leading it, and it seemed to be actually productive because if all the departments, as Donald said, would work together for against climate change, I think there would be, because there are no clear roles and responsibilities, many things would be swept under the rug. And if there is one department with one clear goal at fighting climate change and coming up with strategies and policies, then they can be much stronger. And because they have this clear role to do so, there is maybe less things are being swept under the rug since we have this department.
So great comment. And that raises another question. Europe and the US are two culturally very different places, although both highly developed countries. And they have different attitudes and different approaches to some of the big problems. Any comments on the way Europe, the contrast between the way Europe and the US are approaching climate?
Europe has
Don?
had, well, I'll just make a quick comment that Europe has had much less problem with deniers affecting gumming up the works. That unfortunately has kept people trying to turn the science of climate change into something as political has been a real problem here, and I think it has really greatly slowed us down. There seems to be less of that in Europe. On the other hand, Europe has, the EU is a formation of a number of different countries interacting together, and it has its own issues in terms of really making effective policy, and that has appeared in many different ways. So they have many. So we have, some different stresses on us. I think as we look across those two different units.
So I'll put a provocative statement on the table that Europe has started sooner than the States in dealing with climate effectively.
Certain parts of Europe, particularly.
And that's meant to be provocative, of course.
Yeah.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Well,
Fellows or panelists? Yeah, Pam.
Yeah, I was just going to say in general is that the EU in its essence is it's an approach to an integrated system of governance, right? It is, it has some things that does well, and it doesn't take, in my opinion, enough of a systems approach because it could do so much more, right? It takes a real governance approach, right? Where everything can be done through policies and can be done through, kind of like, typical government types of things where it could do so much better. Like, for instance, to have this climate group that is just like I was saying in the States, it also could have some authority, right? But it isn't necessarily going to be like some umbrella thing over everything else. It's more that thing that reaches out and does it's like a symphony, right? It's the conductor and it gets the things done, but it has some authority to say, when I say strings, I need those strings to come in, right? So I kind of view it a little bit as that they're further along in the sense that they kind of already are thinking of how are we going to pull all these disparate countries and these worldviews together. But I don't think that, in my opinion, that they're necessarily taking all the tools that they could use that would do a better job of that actually could be more of a symphony and less of just a bunch of different, strings and bass just playing music, right? And not necessarily coming together.
Great comment. Anybody want to offer a perspective? I'm looking at the fellows as well as our panelists. And it's, of course, a complex subject. So I would say all the comments we've heard so far are relevant to a certain extent. Europe maybe has more extreme differences. If you look at the larger, not just the 27 or 28, but you look at the larger continental makeup, there are very strong differences between the parts of Europe, maybe stronger than between the parts of the United States. And that's something that really has to be dealt with. And I do think, Don, you put your finger on it. Somebody has to be able to mediate. It's not a question of legislating. To a certain extent it is, but you have to get a certain amount of agreement.
I have a clarifying question.
Sure.
What is the problem that a systems approach is trying to solve? And what does that solution look like in practice?
Okay, so since I've been studying systems, I've learned a couple of different words to use. And one of them is, it isn't really a problem, single problem. It's a class of problems. It's the type of problem And there's an article called, it's written by Riddle and Weber in 1979. And it basically, there were a couple of planners, and they were trying to grapple with the fact that they had these different stakeholders that viewed the problem so differently. And they were trying to apply operations research and optimization programs to these planning problems. And they were failing, just like I described in my career, failing over and over again, because it was these problems could not be defined. And so everyone defined them differently. And so they came up with the term wicked problem. There are about 10, kind of like classifications of what a wicked problem is. But we know them, right? We know that, like for instance, climate change is a clear one because, we've got economics involved, we have the environment involved, we have human health involved, we have, experts, scientists that are anticipating things. Those are people who all have their perspective of the problem, and we have deniers, right? So we have these different perspectives, and we're not going to be able to come up with a solution. We can't optimize into one solution for that, right? So what we talk about oftentimes is managing wicked problems versus solving them, because they are so big and they keep changing. Just as soon as you define it, you take some actions on them. And as soon as you take actions on them, it changes the problem, right? Because you're changing something here, well, it connects to here and here, and you didn't think about that. And so what happens is second and third order effects, are everywhere. We think we're solving a problem here, and it actually causes more of a problem here. Or we come in here and we realize we missed a whole opportunity over here. So part of it is actually, picking battles for these really huge problems. How do you choose which things to do first that don't actually make the problem worse in other ways? So, transnational organized crime, in my case, that was an issue. We had, Chicago policeman who saw it completely in his own realm of trying to take care of the gangs on the street, where we have people from the Department of State are saying, but really a lot of this starts out in these countries that have, such little opportunity, and they end up becoming part of the gangs that produce the drugs, right? So it's those kind of problems are not single problems. Some problems can be engineered. Some problems we call complicated. You can break them down into their parts. You can understand the parts. You can put it together and then actually have a solution. And there are many problems like that. And thank God that we have great technologies and great scientists that can do that. But these are problems that are social problems. These are problems that have too much of a social aspect and different perspectives, that having this concept of an optimal one solution just doesn't work. And so that's where system science comes in. It in my mind, it is the first thing you look at to try to understand the problem from all these perspectives. And then when you design a response for it, that's where you use models. You use anything that can help you anticipate, because systems have to be anticipatory to work. That's where you start looking at all the data that you can collect to say, well, how can we understand things better now that we see that the problem is quite complex and interdependent and has lots of different stakeholders. And those are the types of problems. So wicked problems, and you can look it up on the internet. You can get all sorts of definitions, but those are the types of problems that system science is really kind of geared towards trying to, we call it respond to problems, manage problems versus solve them, because the solving is kind of a expectation that we never really can achieve in some of these problems,
Interesting point, Pam. Don, you may want to make a comment. If not, I'm going to shift to a slightly different topic.
Maybe just a quick one. As a scientist and engineer, my tendency is to think in terms of physical solutions, but too often we do not consider the human dimensions as we looked at solutions. So things like equity become extremely important, and that's, for example, a major issue in many cities, including Chicago. And I have learned that as a scientist and engineer, I need to also interact with social scientists towards how we determine the right solutions to look across that broader range of systems. So it's so that kind of thinking, is important. We do want to break out of the silo way of just problem solving, because that's not only going to lead to potential issues with other parts of the silos, other sectors, but also there's broader issues related to the human dimensions.
And that's a wonderful lead into what I wanted to bring up, Don, that we've been hearing a lot about environmental justice, sometimes called energy justice or climate justice, with the new administration. And they're rightly pointing out that there are marginal, underserved communities that have pretty much been left out of the conversation. And talk about a silo, that's a silo that maybe doesn't have enough recognition yet. But what I'm wondering, and here's kind of the question for discussion, is given that we do have to pay attention to climate justice, how can we best do that? I've heard some of our speakers, even at SISE, have said, well, part of the problem is that the underserved and marginal communities are simply not ever in the conversation. So we don't listen to them and ask them, what do you need? What's your top priority? We might make an assumption, oh, their top priority is this, but that, of course, is a decision made from our own cultural perspective. So I maybe ask everyone, the fellows and the panelists, what does it mean, climate justice? How can we start to really address that problem?
Well, I'll comment that there's a kind of systems approach called critical systems thinking. And it has, part of it is something called boundary critique. Whenever you start to look at a problem and you want to start analyzing the problem in the sense of how you're going to come up with some interventions to the problem, you have to put a boundary on the system or on the problem, right? Because these problems are so huge and they're so interdependent that you have to start by kind of putting a boundary on them to be able to get your hands around it to start off with. And that first step in actually putting a boundary on it is very critical, because if you don't have the right people in the room to put the boundary on it, you're going to marginalize somebody. And it isn't that you don't know that you probably will end up marginalizing, but it has to be critical. You have to recognize it, you have to know it, you have to think in terms of the fact of that, if I'm going to put the boundary here where it marginalizes somebody, I'm going to actually be able to pull that in if I have to. I need to know it's there. I need to know that, right? Or I could say in the beginning that, gee, there's a gap. We have no perspective of the problem from this group. And then they have to be part of the boundary critique. Well, the boundary critique goes on through the analysis, where you keep asking questions. Am I marginalizing anybody? So as a system scientist, I'm not a problem solver or an expert. I'm a facilitator of a systems improvement. And if you think that way, you start thinking about, do I have the right people in the room? And so, for instance, I just got done with a study in Chicago on looking at how to improve STEM education in a predominantly Black and economically challenged Austin community. And we talked to all of the folks, different people, with business people, we talked to students, we talked to parents, we talked to the health. I mean, we had these different perspectives coming together into this one big map. And the thing that it really pointed out was where we have gaps and who wasn't at the table, right? It was great that we were bringing all these folks in and somebody made the decision that these folks have to be part of it, this folks have to be, but we discovered that we were really missing, like for instance, the clergy. And the churches and the roles that they play in education in these communities. We had to pull those in because it was clear that we were missing it. So boundary critique is one of the approaches at critical systems thinking that attempts to, where it never can be perfect, but attempts to actually keep asking those questions about who's being marginalized when we start making decisions.
Great comment, Pam.
I may make a couple of comments. I agree with everything Pam said. We've long known with respect to climate change that the poor are impacted more than anyone else because they can't adapt so readily to the changes as they're occurring. And so we've been trying to figure out how to deal with that. With my own group, what we've been trying to do is I say my group, people I coordinate with here at the university and across the state of Illinois and elsewhere, actually, in doing research and looking at solutions is, who can we coordinate with to try to improve this situation? So we're putting a lot of focus right now on Chicago. So we're trying to coordinate with, I can't remember the lady who heads its name, but Blacks and Green in the Chicago region is a group that's trying to look at how the environment relates to poor neighborhoods in Chicago. And a number of the leaders in the city, some of the, I don't know, aldermen's really the right word, but commissioners, I think they're called, that many of them are, some of them are oriented at the poor communities again, and what the issues are in those communities. And so we're trying to connect with them and try to figure out, as we look at issues related to climate change across the community, and we're trying to look at things like nature-based solutions for the community. How do we take into account these questions of justice and equity? We've long known not only that the poor are affected, but we also know if there's extreme heat that crime tends to increase. How do we, and we actually have a new research study out relating to that. How can we help those issues while we're trying to do something about climate change? And it's always in the back of our mind these days. And, and it wasn't like that 4 or 5 years ago. That's something that I just became really sensitive to in the last 4 or 5 years. It's something I continue to struggle with, and but it is there now as something that we need to be considering.
Yeah, good point. And I will tell you that within DOE, we're all asking the question, what does environmental or climate or energy justice mean? It's been made clear to us through DOE channels that we have to deal with that problem. We on the street have to deal with it, we researchers. But we're asking, how can we deal with it? And I think part of our problem, Don, you put your finger on it initially, you said, we tend to be technological and scientific, but this is at least as big a social issue and lots of other dimensions to it than just technology and science. And I think it's, I don't know, remarkable would be a word that you might use, that DOE has brought it to the front of the pack. It's really getting a lot of attention now. And I think a lot of the attention very much resonating with what you said, Don, that we're trying to figure out, what does it mean? How can we do something? We know it's a problem. How can we do something about it? What is the most effective way to deal with it? And at least in my case, I don't think we quite have that answer yet.
I certainly don't, but we're working on it.
But we're working on it. That's right, and that's the right direction to go. So I'm looking at the clock. We're 5 minutes over, which is perfectly okay. But I would suggest that we think about adjourning, and maybe let's just see if anybody, fellows, panelists, wants to make a closing comment. And I'm hearing a very loud silence. So I think that means that we're talked out. Thanks for the great discussion. Really want to thank Don and Pam for the perspectives they brought to the table. Very interesting. Thank the fellows, of course, for the questions, as there always are. As I said, there's never a moment of silence, no dead air.